But like there's certain physical innate abilities that we all have. I happen to have really large lungs, which is perfect for something like rowing or cross-country skiing, as it turns out. To the degree that you can find those things that you have sort of an unfair advantage in naturally, I would start there if you can, because if you do something that you have the ability to be good at, you're going to like it more. And that's not to say don't play the other sports and don't try other things, but like when you find that thing that you have talent in, that's going to breed success and that's going to breed confidence and you're going to enjoy it and it's going to feed itself.
Well, welcome everyone to another fantastic episode of Masters of the Game. And today I get to introduce you to another Olympian, a man I was introduced to through another person that I interviewed. And it's such a small world when you get into athletics, right? Who knows who? And when I asked the question of like, hey, who's one person that I must talk to? Hans' name was at the top of the list, and I get to introduce him here in a second. So as I always do, I get to brag just a little bit about the guests that we have on. So Hans has to listen to this. But Hans Struzyna, he originates from Seattle, Washington, has a fascinating background. He actually attended the University of Washington. He was a rower with UW. For those who are not familiar, it's called the UW. You got to call it UW. Won 2 national championships with UW, and then got to compete in the men's 8 event at the 2016 Summer Olympics. And we're going to dive into all things rowing, all things Olympics, all things national championships, the mindset of an athlete. And now what's really cool is Hans and his wife are actually top real estate agents in the Bay Area here in the United States, and have leveraged that athletic opportunity and that mindset into what they do today. But without further ado, Hans, welcome to the interview. Thank you for taking your time with me.
Matt, thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
It's so fun. Now, I want to start off with, you and I talked a little bit in preparation for this, but I don't know for those listening and watching right now, if you've read the book, Boys in the Boat, or if you've seen the movie Boys in the Boat that came out not too long ago. But the book is really good. The movie I thought was really good as well. But it's the story of the University of Washington and the rowing. And it was during, right before World War II started, and just like amazing story that we go through. And you actually got to live the world of University of Washington rowing, which I think is amazing.
Yeah, the 1936 crew, when you show up as a freshman, that and the fight song are like the 2 things you must learn. Like you have to memorize the fight song and you have to memorize the lineup of that crew. So every guy's name and the significance and the history behind it. And it's, you walk into the Conibear Shell House down on the shores of Lake Washington, just behind the football stadium. And you see the actual shell hanging up in the rafters. You see all this memorabilia, the trophies, the photos, not just of that crew, though they're prominently displayed, but of generations, literally over 100 years of tradition and history. And they're kind of the pinnacle of it. And then there's obviously been a lot of us who have been fortunate to write a small portion of that history as well.
That's amazing. Well, so I want to dive in a little bit to how did you get into rowing? I mean, you grew up in Seattle, I know that.
Yep.
But how did you get into that sport, and what did you love so much about it?
Yeah, after I left, they tagged Seattle Rowtown, USA. It is rowing is to Seattle like, baseball, football are to a lot of other places. Not that we don't have strong traditions in some of those more traditional sports, but rowing has deep, deep roots in the city.
Yes.
It's also really visible because you've got bodies of water that all the neighborhoods and the cities and the bridges and the freeways kind of go by. And so you can see it in a way that you don't necessarily see it in other cities. Like I'm thinking Washington, D.C.,
yes,
on the Potomac, or like the Schuylkill in Philly. Like you kind of see it you physically, but it's like it's way more prominent in Seattle for a variety of reasons. So as a result, people kind of know about it, and then there's more access to it through just knowing. And so when we joined, we being my family, we took some summer lessons just as a thing to do over the summer together. out on Lake Sammamish, which is next to Lake Washington and feeds into Lake Washington. And we learned as a group to row there. And then I was kind of in this weird spot where I was, it was between freshman and sophomore year that summer. I grew late. And so I was a bit too small for football. Like the year before I'd played football, and I was the oldest and the smallest kid. Yeah. So that's not a great combo to be on a football team.
No,
usually being the biggest and the youngest is better. Mm-hmm. And so I could have probably played some of those other sports, but I just, developmentally and where I was, maturity wise and so forth, it just wasn't a fit. So I tried rowing. Then there was a summer youth program, which I did a couple weeks during the summer, which then led to the fall season, which I joined and kind of never looked back.
That's amazing. What did you like so much about the sport, right? Because we all try different things and and some sports resonate more than others, for all of us. But what was there something, I don't know, just about the sport or the like, what was it? What about it like just drew you to it?
Rowing's interesting in that I've done a lot of other sports. Like there's a lot of team sports that say it's like the ultimate team sport, but I really think rowing is the ultimate team sport because you're physically in the same boat together, and you can have a superstar and then you can have everybody else, and it doesn't matter because you all get the same place and you're all literally trying to move the same boat together. And if you're out of sync or one person's doing something out of sync, like they're not going to like pick the boat up and carry it across the finish line themselves. So it's just, you're not going to have someone take over a race like that. You're going to have a crew come together and take over a race, but not an individual. And I really started to get that pretty quickly. And then I realized that it wasn't so much about like how high I could jump or how hard I could hit someone or throw or whatever. It was about what I could do internally, like on the rowing machine or in the boat, and then how I could contribute to like the bigger whole. And that, for whatever reason, just really appealed to me at the time. And then I continued to grow and enjoy that and see that like, if I put energy into this sport, I can get direct results back, because you measure yourself based on your times on the rowing machine, on the erg.
Yes.
Anyone who knows CrossFit, what the erg is. They call it a rower, but it's called an ergometer. And we measure ourselves for 2,000 and 6,000 meter pieces. And like your time is like a big piece of your value in a rowing team. And then how well you translate that into the boat is sort of the next level of that.
That's so interesting. Well, I think that's a really fascinating point though, too, because, I'm now, I've told you before, I had a friend of mine at Creighton who was on the rowing team, but it was a club sport at Creighton. And she took me out once, and it was one of the most challenging things. It was in a two person boat, and it was really difficult. I kept digging the oar too deep. I was digging the oar. I was too shallow. I mean, I felt all over the place. And then you started getting in a rhythm, things like that. So it's one of the most challenging things. So I can kind of see that, right? Of like, and then you watch the movie and you watch the 8, and they get in that sync, right? Of like, it's seamless, that they're like pulling as one, and it's a difficult thing to achieve. I'm curious, when you look back, because in the Olympics you did the 8-man boat, right? Mm-hmm. And then in college, did you do the 8-man as well, or was it different? And what allows you to get in sync? Like, what are there secrets to like getting in sync? Is it the type of person? Is it the like practice? Like, what have you seen like where it's just smooth?
That's a really important part of the sport. And what I'll say about rowing as just a sport in general is the number of hours you put in proportion to how much time you're racing. It's ridiculously disproportionate. A rowing race depends on the boat class, but it's the world record's 5:18, 5 minutes and 18 seconds. And then, if you're in a 2-person or 1-person boat, you're in the 6-minute range, and, possibly 7.
Yes.
Going sub 7 in a single is a pretty good indicator, but you're not winning an Olympic medal with that time. So you're but you're in that range, right?
Yes.
And then you're training 20, 30 hours a week all year. And then you race, I don't know, 10, 15, maybe 15 times a year. So it's like, it's totally disproportionate. But it's just, you're training the physiology, you're training the muscle memory, you're training, the lung capacity, all that stuff. But you're also training the crew to to sync and to gel in those moments. And then when you find it in practice, you'll be able to hopefully replicate it when it matters. And then, and then it's just about performing in that moment and then on that day.
Yes.
So how do you find it? I think that's a combination of, just all teamwork. We all know sort of that cliche about like all for one, one for all kind of thing, but like really identifying those personalities, that team, and then people's strengths and where to put them in the boat, and then how they complement one another and so forth. And then it's repetitions and persistence. And then it's like, sometimes it hits on the day and sometimes it doesn't. And then that's why you train so much, is so that like on your worst day, you hit it in the day that it matters.
Yes. So I have so many questions, because I think this is super important, right? Because so from a teamwork perspective, like every sport, rowing is unique for sure. And in every sport, we're trying to figure out how do we get the mentality that like we're actually a team, right? Because how cliche is that? Like we're one.
Yeah.
And some teams are like, really? Is that true? And in rowing, you have to have that mentality. So it sounds like it starts there with like everyone's bought into like, we have to figure this out together.
Yep. It's a very unselfish sport for a variety of, it has to be. I mean, there are egos, of course. There are people who are really good and have great, consistently winning boats and are doing really well on the erg machine, all that stuff.
Yes.
That exists. And that's sort of the game inside of the game. But at the end of the day, you have to go get in a boat with 1 other to 7 other people and make the thing go as fast as possible. And there has to be a trust both directions. Like you trust them, they trust you. Don't necessarily need to be best friends with them, but like when you're going to compete and put in these, thousands of hours a year, and then we're going to put our trust in each other that on a race day in 5.5 minutes or so, like it's going to come together and we're going to get the goal we want to get. Like that's where rowing, I think, separates in a way that like, traditional sports like basketball, football, like there are some really important positions. And then there's like one person makes one play on one down and it changes the entire game. That doesn't exist in rowing. And then even in, something like cycling, like they have cycling teams in the peloton, but they're all trying to push the one guy, the leader, forward in the general classification. And it's like everyone else is sacrificing themselves for the one guy.
Yes.
So like, it's a really unique sport in that regard. And it forces people who have big egos and don't play nice, don't make it very far ultimately, or they go row the singles. So they're like the only person.
True.
Right?
True.
Yeah.
That's a great point. Well, and when you look at, like, if we take the eight person boat, right, as an example, you talked about how, and you see this in the movie too. I act like I'm some sort of expert because I watched a movie, right?
Yeah.
No clue. But you see him like switching people around. You said like there's different positions, right? So how do you pair people up based on where they're at in the boat?
Right.
Can you describe for me a little bit, like, what are those kind of positions and what skill sets or mindsets, I guess, work best in the different parts of the boat?
Yeah. I mean, when you really start to get into a higher level and very technical and, data driven, what you're looking at essentially is everyone's got this thing called a force curve. And so you think about the rowing stroke and you put it on a graph, you've got the length of the time the oar is in the water. Yes. So there's that's your X, and your Y axis is power at positions in. So you've got this curve. Yes. And somewhere in the middle of that curve, you peak, and then you got to try to hold on to it. And then you take the oar out of the water and it's gone again.
Yes.
So you want people to be able to match that curve up in a certain way so that they're all sort of peaking at right around the same time and they have a similar angle on that whole thing. you also want to have it for boat classes. So like the 8 is moving so fast in the water and it doesn't slow down as much in the water in between strokes that you need someone to be able to put the oar in the water and generate power really fast. It's like you're on a bike pedaling downhill. You need to keep your feet spinning if you're going to add anything to the flywheel, right? Whereas a 4 or a double, it's not moving as fast in the first place and it's slowing down more in between strokes. And so if you jam on it too early, it's actually going to give you a diminishing return. So you got to pick it up, get it accelerated, and then you want to peak a little later. Again, that's really, really advanced. But that's kind of what you're trying to figure out is like who matches those force curves really well. And then in the boat itself, there's nuances because like in the bow, the people in the front of the boat, you want them to actually pick the boat up and like have a slightly earlier peak in an ideal world. So like the bow of the boat, they lift it up out of the water subtly. So there's less resistance on the hull. And then the guys in the middle have this really light front end and they can just jam into the middle of the stroke and like you pick it up and you drive it forward. And so you've got your big, strong guys, your tallest guys, your physically your heaviest guys, usually in the middle. And then the guys in the stern or the stroke is how you probably heard it in the movie.
Yes.
Is those are your pace guys. Those are the cadence people. They're the ones who are really, they're what we would call a racer. They're someone who kind of have that instinct, that drive, that fire in there. And then they've got sort of a cadence that's easy to follow. They can set the tone. They can feel the crew in a certain way. And then you've got a coxswain sitting in the stern. And the two of the stroke and the coxswain really have to kind of be in sync well and feel the crew, what's going on, make adjustments, that sort of thing. So it's all kind of a dance of these different strengths, ideal, like what's your style, when you peak, when you don't, your body weight, that sort of thing as well.
So it's so fascinating to me just to think about it. And so, I'm a coxswain. I'm looking down the entire boat, right, at all the things, and I'm paying attention to the back, right, the stern, to your point.
Yep.
Especially because that's going to be they're my pace setters, really, right? So I'm trying to coordinate with them as the coxswain on the boat. Go ahead. Who's the best coxswain you've had, and what was so unique about that person that made them so good, or just keep the boat together?
I've had a few that were great. In college, we had a woman named Caitlin Snyder. She's now married, and I can't remember if she changed her last name or not. But she was our college coxswain, and when I was a sophomore, she was awesome. She just had this fiery attitude. She really understood the sport really well. She had a feel for the boat, and she had this voice that was like, because she, if you're not sitting directly in front of her, you're just hearing through the microphone.
Yes.
And so she had this voice and she had this way of like calling people out and calling the race cadence and that sort of thing that just kind of fired you up a little bit. And she obviously had the skills if she could steer the boat straight. She understood like the race plan really effectively. She could feel the race well. And then Sam Azurkas, who was my coxswain my senior year in college, as well as on the Olympic team when we went to Rio, he similarly had that same thing. He had a very different approach and style to Caitlin, but he really understood how to get the most out of you, how to really call the race, where he knew to hold back or to push or whatever in appropriate moments. And he just had this kind of fire in him. He was like a scrappy guy too. He was a lot of fun to race with as well.
Did those two individuals, I won't say study you guys, but how did they get to know you well? Was it just time on the water and they tried different things of, I'm going to be a little softer with Hans, but I'm going to yell at this person over here, or I'm going to yell at Hans, or was that it?
Yeah, there's an element of that. I think the other thing that gets a little tricky with coxswains is they're not doing the work physically. And so some of them don't quite understand what that work is and that means. And so I think some of them get a little bit of a mentality that they're a coach and they're somehow superior. And that breeds resentment when you've got this 120-pound person yelling at you and you're like, you have no idea what you're talking about. So there is a balance there, but I think, yeah, it's, I mean, people call it like a jockey, which feels a little bit sort of dulled down. It's more nuanced than that because the horse is a human in this case, and 8 humans in the fact of an 8. And so you got to treat everyone a little differently. And yeah, you push certain buttons or you don't push certain buttons. And, like at certain points in the race, this person gets a little fatigued and they do this or that. And so you pull their attention towards it or whatever. So that kind of stuff. Absolutely. And that you can only develop over time.
Yes. Well, I think that's the important part, right? Where it's kind of interesting because, I've done a ton of these interviews, right? And there's certain themes that pop up, Hans, right? And one of them is when you're talking about from a leadership perspective, right? Which I'll put, everyone in the boat is a leader and the coxswain's the one watching the whole thing, that orchestra going on, right? And that person has to spend time with each individual and try different things to get to know, like, it's what motivates them, right? I don't care if you're playing baseball, soccer, or rowing. Like, as leaders, you have to start understanding like how to push the buttons, when to press go, when to back off. And that comes to your point with time, right? But I have to be invested in that and try to figure out how to do it. And the other thing too, I love what you said is, as athletes, like, how do we start understanding the perspective of the other person?
Yep.
And so, if you're not used to playing a certain position or sitting at this part of the boat, it's like, well, let me try it. Let me see it. Let me talk to you about it. Let me understand it. Because that's going to make me more effective when we're actually in it together, right? Understanding what you're going through.
Yep, absolutely. And then there's this, like, the physics of rowing, like the way the boat sort of surges through the water and like the acceleration and deceleration. It's not a linear line. Like, the boat will literally, like, you watch an acceleration curve, it'll literally kind of have this dolphin wave hump up and down. And inside of that boat, it's literally kind of rising and falling through the water as you go.
Yes.
And on top of that, you need to feel it. You need to let it do that naturally. And if you're like pushing too far and you finish the stroke and you get out of the bow with your handle too quickly, like, you'll disturb that completely. And so there's an element of like, I'm moving really fast, my heart rate is jacked through the roof, but I got to like be smooth out of here and let the boat move. Because if you get ahead of it, you get ahead of the rhythm, then it totally throws the whole thing off and you lose the guys in front and behind you. So there's like a really fine line between these two extremes of like too much, not enough.
It's so fascinating. When you talk about like the best rowers that you've, competed with, what makes, like, I don't know, one of them great versus others where you're like, yeah, could we switch him out, please? Or like, but what makes a great rower in your mind and a great teammate?
Oh man, there's so many things that I can come up with. I think the people who are great, whether like everyone's got an ego, especially as you go up the levels of sport, right? Like, you're the best high school guy, then you're probably one of the best guys on your college team. And then you're like, you're in the top half of the national team or the Olympic team or whatever. Like, it happens, right? Yes. That's how it is. But I think the guys who were the best to race with were the ones who really came at it with not so much like I'm right or I have this status and so listen to me, but it was there was more of a generally like a collaborative effort and a desire to win, and like them bringing what they know to the table because A, they've earned it, and B, they have the same goal as you, and they're not. Yes. And then, it's easy to be like, well, I've been to the Olympics before, you haven't, shut up, and so that kind of thing, just that stuff didn't really work, I think. Yes. Especially because you're starting to split hairs at a certain point with that sort of thing. Yes. But I think in general, there's no shortcut for the work. And so the guys, for example, when we would do weight sessions, there was a lot of guys who I saw cutting corners in the weight room, for example. And like we would do these weight sessions, and then I would partner up with a couple guys during the 2016 year, and the three of us would lift together, and we'd be almost the last ones out of there, if not the last ones out of there almost all the time, partially because there was three of us versus two of us, and partially because we were spending time actually lifting weights, as opposed to like jerking around and, you know, throwing a few plates around and getting out of there. And so, you know, when you started to look at, like, in retrospect, who made the team and who cut out early, I think there was a pretty inverse relationship to those kinds of things too.
Yes.
And, you know, it's like how you do anything is how you do everything is sort of the succinct way to put that. And so, like, the guys who were in there doing the work, you could see the gains, they were getting stronger. Weights aren't like the thing that everyone thinks about in rowing. And to be fair, they're not necessarily the thing that makes the boat go fast, but it was injury prevention.
Yes. You
were putting on more muscle mass, you were, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And the guys who were really focused on that are more or less the ones who ended up making it. Interestingly. I mean, yeah.
Well, I love that phrase. I mean, how you do anything is how you do everything, right? So it's that consistent approach to, I saw some post, I don't know where this was on social, I can't remember which social channel, but this picture of a kid running, you know, wind sprints, right? And he's just short of the line.
Yep.
About going back the other way. And we all hear is, it's like, get through the line, right? Or finish the workout, or, you know, you're stopping short or something like that. And it's like, how you do anything is how you do everything. So,
yep. We had, I'll tell you this, when at UW, we do this thing over spring break called class day. So you race a race on Saturday of spring break where you get in the boat from your freshman year. So it's all people from your class, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, seniors. And my senior year, we were in a position where we could have won 3. So we won as freshmen, we won as juniors, and then we had a shot to win as seniors. And then right before the finish line, someone on the shore had an air horn, and we were so close to the finish line, we thought we had crossed. We hadn't. And the other boat sort of drifted past. They thought it was over too, but they kept their hands on their oars and then took like one more stroke, and then they and got ahead of us. The lesson there was like, go through the line, like make sure you go well through the line. So that year at the national championship, when all of our boats on the varsity team won their respective races, varsity, junior varsity, 3V, and the 4, every single boat took like a stroke or two through the line. And you watch the videos, it's like everybody was through the line, like well through the line before they celebrated. And that was a crappy way to learn that lesson, because that's a very pride driven race to win in our inner squad. But, you know, at the end of the year, when we all crossed the finish line at the national championship, like everyone was through the line. And that was a big lesson for the team to take home, and, you know, it paid off.
That's amazing. Well, and again, you know, 2 national championships, which is incredible. And then going to the Olympics. I mean, I have to ask, like, what's one of your best memories from like your rowing days?
My senior year at the IRA was a pretty special memory. IRA is the Intercollegiate Rowing Championship. It's been going on since the boys in the boat. Because men's rowing, for the time I was there, was not an NCAA sport officially. So we did not have an NCAA championship. That is slowly changing, but it's still called the IRA. But that's a Title IX and all the inner workings of all of that stuff. I don't know how it all. Women's rowing is NCAA, men's is kind of gray. Frankly, I haven't kept up with that part of it. But at the time, that's what it was. But yeah, winning that as a senior and doing so in really pretty stunning fashion. We had basically the final. It's 6 boats, and it's kind of like swimming lanes. Everyone's got their lane, but they're 2,000 meters long, and through about 800 or 900 meters, so almost halfway, there were 5 boats within half a boat length, maybe even 6 boats within half a boat length, which is pretty rare for that level of racing. the level has continued to rise, and it's like these races are getting more and more competitive, which is awesome to see. But that was the first time that had happened, where usually it's like 2, maybe 3 boats that punch out, and we had a tight race. And then third 500 comes along, which is where you really start to make your money in rowing. And we pulled away. And then fourth 500, we were a length up, and it was just like, get to the finish line and we're done. And that was a pretty awesome, I still remember like going through that third 500, seeing the buoy for the 500 to go mark and looking over, and there's no one there. And
it's a great feeling.
And in rowing, that is truly the best feeling, is like when you're winning a rowing race, you see everybody that you're beating. Whereas when you're losing, they're all behind you. You can't see them. And it's a pretty great feeling. And then we went and looked at the GPS after the race. And what we realized was we didn't speed up. The entire field slowed down. And so we just actually maintained our speed through the middle of the race really well. And the field faded, and it just sort of validated like all the work we had done that year, all the fitness, all the training, all the different tactics and things we had put together. And it was just like the perfect race piece. Like if you could like draw it out ahead of time, as far as like your percentages and the way you shift and move, like that was it. That was pretty ideal.
That's incredible. It's got to be a great feeling. Well, and it's interesting because you hear that rowing is one of the most physically demanding sports, right? Because even in those short, periods of time, but outside of, the 10-ish races a year that are around 5 to, whatever minutes, great. It's super intense. And then the training is super intense.
Yep.
How did you, just deal with that physicality? How did you maintain, just the energy levels? And then ultimately, like, how do you stay level-headed when you need to pull, but you don't want to? And I imagine you had that happen, but maybe not.
Yeah. It is a grind of a sport, because there's no real off season. You take like a couple weeks after the national championship or the world championship, depending on your level.
Yes.
In the summertime, and that's always good and healthy, but not more than a couple weeks, because it's just you roll back into it, and it's the whole sport is your VO2 max is how much oxygen you can process in a given amount of time, and then how efficiently you can exert, and then create lactic acid or not, and like when that happens, and then managing it, and your body's ability to deal with all that.
Yes,
that's the sport essentially. And so you can't substitute that with, without having the training. And so, a lot of it in the fall is all just long and low, 2 hours of lower intensity. And then as you ratchet up towards races, it's shorter distances, but way higher intensity. And you're doing, 3 by 1500 or, 8 by 500 or whatever it is that you're doing. And the training changes through the year. So the hardest part of the year was always sort of late January till about March, especially in Seattle. It's crappy weather. It's gray, it's raining, it's cold. And that's when you just put the work in, and you're putting the hay in the barn, as we used to say. And those are the times when it sucks. It's cold, it's not fun. It's probably dark the entire workout.
Yes.
If you're going in the morning or the evening or whatever. So that time was always a grind, because you're far enough away from racing, but you're close enough that if you mess up the training, it's going to matter.
Yes.
I think that's where you found a lot of camaraderie, and that's where you really start to gel. And that's, we have this thing called type 2 fun. So there's type 1, which is it's fun right now in the moment. Type 2 is it's fun after the fact. And so in retrospect, it's like you go on a hike and it's cold and it's raining sideways and you're soaked and it sucks. And then you get back to the car and everyone's like, oh, that was kind of cool, actually. That's type 2 fun. Yes. And so that's what January, February, and March in rowing is. And so we would all just sort of bond around the fact that it sucked. And then we would go to the football game, well, not at that time, but we'd go out and do fun things afterwards, or we'd have a paintball outing every year in college, or we'd, go bowling, or I don't know, we'd do other things too that kind of broke that monotony up a little bit. Yep. But I think in general, it was just like, there was camaraderie around the suck of it.
I think it's an important thing, right? Hear people say like embrace the suck and all that sorts of things, and people are like, I don't want it to suck, but it's that type 2 fun. I like the way that's described, right?
Yeah.
Which
like
is so
David
true.
Goggins lives in type 2.
Right, true.
Yeah.
But how many times we all, like, now you have me thinking about all those times, right, where you work through something and it's not fun in the moment, but what happens after, you're like, I'm so glad I did that.
Yeah.
Whether it turns out the way you want it or not, you're still like, I'm so glad I did that. Put in the time, put in the effort, lifted the weights, got through the line, did the workout, because it makes a difference in the long run.
Yep. And I think the other thing you gotta, like, it's when you think about it in too long of a time period that it got overwhelming. If you thought more of like in smaller chunks of time, like a week, or in some cases the morning session, just get through the morning session and go to breakfast. That's what it was at some point. You just had to really condense your time horizon and not think too much about like 6 more weeks of this. It would just, that would burn you out.
That's a good point. I like the mentality, right? Yeah. Shrinking the time chunks down and do this.
Yeah. It's like, if I get through this session, get my breakfast, I can go back to bed, like sometimes that was the goal, basically,
That's a good point. And then at that moment, you're willing to embrace more of the suck as you're going through it. And you have, again, something good come that you get to look forward to afterwards, right? A hot meal, something like that.
Yeah. And that's like the delayed gratification of it. In football, you've got training camp in the summer and it's hot and it's sweaty and scratchy because of the grass and all the stuff, right? Like you just are like, there's always these moments of like, at a certain point you have to suffer and you have to be okay with that. And I think that when you're trying to remain too comfortable all the time is when you miss out on the good stuff and you leave something behind you, like you don't find out where greatness is. And it's generally just on the other side of leaning into that feeling of like, it hurts, it's uncomfortable, I don't like it.
Yes. Where does your motivation come from, I guess? Like, because I think a lot of times, I'll come across athletes that, we say like, some people have it, some people don't, right? And when we say some people have it, I'm not talking about like they have talent, obviously, but I'm talking more about the work ethic, right? That they're willing to do what others aren't willing to do, right? Put in the thousands of hours for, 50 minutes of racing during the year, right? Or, whatever it might be, but you have that, like, where does it come from you personally?
I told you I grew late. And so I think I had a chip on my shoulder around being the small kid for a long time. And then I grew eventually, and I spent a lot of time in the weight room in high school. And my senior year was unrecognizable relative to my sophomore year in a lot of ways. And then I had a lot of like, I'm going to prove this person wrong or that group wrong, or just, the devil on your shoulder kind of thing. It's like, you can't, you're too small, you're too this, you're too that. Right. And so there's a lot of that started it. And then I think when you realize, or when I realized that I had an opportunity to go to the next level, it's like, am I actually good enough? Can I actually pull this off? And then it's just, you take the leap of faith, you go for it. And then it's like, okay, I'm here now. I got to make the most of this opportunity. I'm not just like happy to be here. If I'm going to be here, I'm going to be here to win and be the best. And where that came from, I would probably suggest family. There's probably a nature and a nurture component of that.
Yes.
Like my grandfather came from Germany and was a refugee, and his mom was in a concentration camp, and like he escaped West Germany or East Germany under the belly of a train, and like wow. And then he moved to the United States with my dad and like raised them with some of that mentality, which surely got passed to me through a lot of ways. So there's some of that like family history stuff, and then there's the stuff you pick up when you're a child, and someone makes fun of you and you're like, I'm going to prove you wrong. And, then that takes you to the Olympics. I always joke that like,
so good.
There's 10,000 beds in the Olympic Village, and of those 10,000 beds, every single one of them has a chip on them somewhere, because there's a kid in every one of those athletes who is proving someone wrong somewhere along their journey. And, there's a kindred spirit inside the village of like, even if I don't speak the same language as you, I totally get where you're coming from.
I love that. And I think having a chip on your shoulder is a huge piece, right? Because that's a lot of cases doesn't always go that way, but it tends to kind of force you in that direction. If you have that mindset and you make that choice, which I think the most powerful thing you said is that you've made that choice of, I'm going to go find out whether I'm proving you wrong, or I'm going to prove I can, since I'm here, I'm going to take advantage of this opportunity. But it's those daily choices that you made along the way. Yeah,
I think I read a book the other day that talked about how much adversity is enough and too much, especially for kids. And I think there's a right amount of adversity for all of us. Obviously there's trauma. There's like the loss of a parent or some awful car accident or something like that's, I think we can all agree that's too much. But like, if you never have to like rub up against something hard or hear the word no or whatever, like, I think we can also agree that that's not enough. Yes. And so I think somewhere in the middle is there's this sweet spot. And, some of us are fortunate to like have that plus or minus a little bit. Some of us aren't. We don't get to choose that. But I think that there's adversity, even if it is a loss of a parent or something, that can fuel you and you can do good with. But I think that's what's hard is like, I didn't like grow up like innately knowing how to deal with that. And so like through coaches and through sport and through parental involvement and friends and all this tribe of people around me, like I figured out how to sort of mold it and turn it into something positive in the end. That wasn't, I was like an angry kid in third grade. I was getting in fights because I had this in me that I just didn't know how to channel it. And then I got help channeling it. Not everyone gets that opportunity. Which I understand, but I think there's always something in there there's like the right amount of it. And then there's the right, people hopefully come into the right places in your life to help you do something with it that turns into something positive.
Yes. That's so true. Well, and I'll be aware of your time here, and I've got a boatload of questions for you that I want to ask, and maybe we'll do a round two one of these days, but
yeah, that'd be awesome.
And you were able to go from, high school to collegiate to the Olympic level, right? Which is pretty rare.
Yep.
What advice, athletes we come across, they want to get to the next level, right? It might be the Olympics. Yep. It might be some professional level. Like it might be just the collegiate level. I want to go from high school to college, right? Maybe I'm on the JV team in high school and I want to get to the varsity team, right? We all have these different stepping stones and dreams of like where we want to play and how, what advice would you give to athletes who want to make that jump, whatever it is, to position themselves to be most successful to actually make that occur? What advice would you give them?
Couple things. One is I would really, to the degree possible, be a realist about your physical abilities, both limitations and strengths. I will never be a cyclist. Like I can ride my bike and go fast and have fun, but I'm never going to ride the Tour de France. Like, look at my body type, look at those guys, not going to happen. Right. I have a good VO2 max, which is great. I have a lot of slow twitch muscle. So I was never going to be like this fast sprinter kind of person, but maybe I could have run the 800 or something. I don't know, whatever. But like, there's certain physical innate abilities that we all have. I happen to have really large lungs, which is perfect for something like rowing or cross-country skiing, as it turns out. Right? Like, so to the degree that you can find those things that you have sort of an unfair advantage in naturally, I would start there if you can, because if you do something that you have the ability to be good at, you're going to like it more. And that's not to say don't play the other sports and don't try other things, but like when you find that thing that you have talent in, that's going to breed success, and that's going to breed confidence, and you're going to enjoy it, and it's going to feed itself.
Yes.
So that's part of it. The other piece is once you find something that you like, whether you have that physical ability or not, like that's when you got to decide like what it's worth to you. And only really you can answer that. Like your parents can't do that. Your coaches can't do that. Ultimately, it's you. Like, how much do you actually want this? How much do you enjoy it? And then what are you willing to tolerate to go through the adversity and the challenge of whatever it is, to get to the other side of, success and making the varsity team or making the Olympic team or whatever it is.
Yes.
And then, at a certain point, you also have, and this is something that I had to do after I left rowing in 2016 was, you can't let a result like the Olympics or the national championship define the entire experience. It is a part, it's a chapter. Yes. It's not the whole book. And when we finished fourth in Rio, I thought that my 12 years was more or less a failure, and it wasn't. And yes, we did not medal in 2016. We were close, and if we had a better race, we probably could have and should have medaled, but we didn't. And that doesn't need to define the entire 12 years. And so I would say, the cliche of like, it's not the destination, it's the journey is true. But I do believe that, because the skills that I learned and refined as a rower, I've now taken into my professional life, and I've taken into other areas that I pursue, personally, and have served me really well. Yes. And it's created a lot of other ancillary opportunities, like here we are on this podcast. Yes. Right. So I would just say, like, find something that you have that skill in, decide what it's worth to you, and then what you're willing to put up with, which hopefully is a lot, once you find that thing. And then, don't let the one result define the entire experience for you.
So good. So good. And probably the best part, if I'm reading right, and tell me if I'm wrong, but you met your wife through rowing.
Yep, that's right.
So if nothing else, I mean, what a great
She's
result.
Also an Olympian. She went to the 2016 or 2012 games in London in the lightweight double. Okay. And we met after she went to the Olympics before I did. And we're rowing at the same club here in Oakland, California. And that's how we met. That's
so awesome. So to your point, it's the journey, not always the destination. And you're writing a book, right? We're not here to focus on one little chapter, but write a book.
Big time. That's exactly right.
That's so amazing. Well, last question, and I'll get us wrapped up. But how can people connect with you to just learn more about, obviously, your background, things like that, and what you're up to now? But how can people best connect with you? Either website, social? Where do you want to direct them?
Yeah, I'm spending a little less time on social media these days, just from a mental health perspective. Mm-hmm. But Instagram is probably where I'm most active. I also have a YouTube channel, but you can't really ping me as easily on YouTube. Yes. But yeah, Chief Snah, SNAH, it's Hans backwards, is my handle on Instagram. I'd say go over there if you want to shoot me a DM and talk about sports, then I'm do that, and I check it periodically.
Love it. Yeah, not every 5 minutes. That's good.
No, I try not to be on there. I have a 30-minute social media timer on my phone, and I try to stick to that. And for the last couple months, I've been pretty good at it.
I love that. I think it's a whole nother episode and discussion point, right, of social media, and it's a beautiful thing. Yet it's one of those things, just like you talked, Hans, of like, what do you want to put up with or do versus not do to achieve what you want to achieve? And if you can limit that, it typically will open up to do more things to help you achieve that
Yep.
goal that you want. So
Yep.
I love that. And we'll put, links to both the YouTube channel and Instagram in the show notes and on the YouTube channel as well. So please connect with Hans. And, I'll wrap us up here in a second, Hans, but I want to say a huge thank you for taking your time with me. And I'm so thankful just that it is a small world in the sports world, right? When you really look at it, because I was so excited to get an introduction to a national championship and Olympic rower, because I don't know a lot about the sport other than, almost flipping myself out of a boat, back at Creighton. But it's so fun to learn and dive into your mindset and your story. So I just can't thank you enough.
Yeah, well, it's my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity and for chatting. And I'm always happy to share.
Well, for those watching, listening right now, I want to say a special thank you to you as well. I'm so excited to bring these to you every single week and talk to Olympians and NFL and MLB and NHL and WNBA and all these different individuals that we get to come across, because there's secrets to success, right? And there's that old saying, success leaves clues. And I know if you took notes, I hope you did, you learned some from Hans today. So thank you so much. Go check out the YouTube channel, subscribe, share it with your friends, family, athletes you play with, coaches, anyone in your sphere, and we'll see you on the next interview. Have a good day, everybody.